So this is going to be an awkward video because the iPhone XR has been out for almost 2 weeks and I'm finally getting started on the camera comparison. Now my kid did come back from daycare and got my entire family sick. I wasn't able to talk for about 4 days, so it's hard to make YouTube videos when you can't talk, or you could only talk for a sentence and end up... Well, that intro did not work out for me. Now if you're short on time, here's my 15-second recommendation when it comes to upgrading your iPhone based on the camera. Now in general, if you're over the top with your selfies, the front-facing cameras on the 2018 iPhones are just amazing. So unless you're using an iPhone X, you could easily justify an upgrade if you're a selfie monger, that is. If you're rocking something like the iPhone 6 or 6 Plus and are thinking about upgrading, then the iPhone XR and XS would both be great upgrades. Now if you're in the iPhone 6s or 6s Plus, you technically could hold on for another year in terms of an upgrade. If you do upgrade and you do use Force Touch a lot, then maybe omit the iPhone XR because certain Force Touch features will not work on the iPhone XR. Now if you've got an iPhone 7 and you're thinking about upgrading, from a camera perspective, there's not a lot that you will really be gaining going from a 7 to a XR or a XS. There's a lot more portrait mode stuff that you'll be getting, but not a whole lot other than that. If you're thinking about upgrading from the 8, you do realize that this device is only a year old. The selfie camera is better on the new iPhones than the 8 Plus, but still, it's just a year old. Save your money. And if you're using the iPhone X, why? Need more details for those recommendations? Well, keep watching. Now personally, I think the cameras on our smartphones are one of the most powerful pieces of technology that we carry around, mostly because it allows us to capture incredibly powerful moments in our lives. For me, being able to capture the sound of my son when he was first born, that blows my mind every single time I watch it. So being able to play that back every once in a while is something incredibly powerful. So upgrading your iPhone or smartphone, or whatever phone you think you should be upgrading to because you want a better camera, in my opinion, is actually it's a very legitimate reason to do so. But the question is, do you go from a 6, a 7, to an 8, or do you go all the way up to the Apple's newest phones, the XR? So with the rear camera, it's been a 12 megapixel count since the 6s when it was an 8 megapixel camera. Can you see the difference? I can't, unless I zoom all the way into the photo. If you're on the 6, you will notice your photos having a bit more detail when you upgrade. Every other camera here isn't really going to see a big difference if you're just looking at it on your device. One of the features that Apple highlights is the inclusion of wide color capture for photos, which is supposed to allow cameras to capture color more accurately. This sounds like an amazing feature, but it does get hamstrung by the fact that your display is going to mess with your actual colors of your photos. My rendering of this video through YouTube is going to mess with those colors as well. I think this feature is going to be very important for professionals who need the accuracy, but for everyday folk like us, well, my black and white dog still looks like a black and white dog across all my devices. The aperture since the iPhone 7s has been at 1.8, which is a bump up from 2.2. This change means that you can have a stronger blurry background effect, the bokeh, and it also means that low light photography is going to be a bit better. Now on the topic of low light photography, Apple's devices have gotten better over time. Some may argue that the Galaxy S lineup is better. The last time I did do a camera comparison between a Galaxy S, it was an S7, and I compared it against a 6S, and it was actually pretty close when it came to low light photography. Now with the newest iPhones, this one, you actually have to work pretty hard to get the low light photography to really work well in your favor. These photos that I'm showing you right now, you really can't see a big difference between the low light shots. And for some, the iPhone 6 photo might actually look better. Now in general, the 2018 iPhones do have less noise in the low light areas, but the strength of the sensor comes into play when you try to take pictures of things in near darkness. You can really bump up the sensitivity of the sensor to get an image. It may not look great, but at least it's something, and that's something that the iPhone 6 can't do. Now the biggest difference in terms of just pure camera, from my perspective, comes from the plus size devices after the 7, as Apple included a telephoto lens which gives you a bit more flexibility in terms of taking photos and improves the zoom that each camera provides. Has the field of view changed over the last 3 years for the zoom? No, it hasn't. HDR photos or high dynamic range photos has been a thing since the 6s, but the last 2 iterations of the iPhone included auto HDR and smart HDR, and honestly, I can't tell the difference between them. Before I move on to the biggest difference, which is portrait mode, I am going to talk about the flash. Now, every device has True Tone flash, which is basically a 2-colored flash, but over the years, we've gone from True Tone to Quad LED True Tone to quad LED True Tone with slow sync. Now for me personally, I think I've been undervaluing the slow sync flash. Now in fact, I generally shy away from flash photography because it just generally sucks. Now, I am a little prejudiced in the fact that when I started taking pictures, it was years ago, and flash just meant everything in your photo just sucked. Now with the slow sync flash, you're going to get lower light photos that are a little more balanced in terms of exposure. Basically, slow sync will fix the zombie photos that you take at parties. So if you look at my test set of photos, you can see that the iPhone 6s photos have the lights lit, but the edges of the photos are quite dark. This is your typical standard flash shot. With the iPhone 7, it is a bit better, but you still have the dark edges. Now with the slow sync photos on the 8s and newers, you'll see that you don't have really dark edges around the entire photo. The exposure of the entire photo just looks a little more balanced. Now the biggest difference when it comes to the rear camera is portrait mode. The only single lens camera to have portrait mode is the iPhone XR, but the iPhone XRs do have a few missing features when compared to the iPhone XSs. In fact, I can safely say that the iPhone XRs, they have a prejudice against taking portrait photos of dogs. Actually, they have a prejudice against anything that's not human. Portrait mode was first introduced on the 7 Plus and was improved with portrait lighting on the 10 and the 8 Plus, and further refined on the 10s with bokeh and depth control. Honestly, will I be using these features on a daily basis? No, but I do have an appreciation for it, given that I do enjoy finding the perfect shot with the DSLR. The coolest thing is the ability to adjust photos after you've taken them natively in the Photos app. That's just wicked. I will add that tweaking the bokeh can only be done on the 10s, not the 10. And as a side note, you can't take a portrait photo on the 10 and then send it to the 10s and edit the bokeh, if you were wondering. Now, is there a difference between the quality of photos in portrait mode? Not that I can see. Still issues around, stuff that's kind of fuzzy being caught in the bokeh and not in the bokeh, but that's kind of normal and expected. Now onto the iPhone XR. With a single lens, you're going to be missing out on two portrait mode features, which are stage and stage mono. I actually think the iPhone XR can handle these settings because I don't think the image, the second lens, is really used to drop the mask on the stage setting and then turning it black and white on the stage mono setting. I'm guessing Apple is hamstringing portrait mode on the XR on purpose. Now with that being said, the inability for the XR to shoot a portrait mode of a non-human subject reveals to me how smart, we'll say, the camera of the newest iPhones actually are. The XR is able to figure out the subject and blur the background of the subject without actually having the second lens to provide distance information. That's kind of my guess anyway. So when it comes to action shots, the newer iPhones definitely are better. Apple always talks about bigger pixels and everything in their keynote, and one of the supposed benefits is better action shots. So luckily for me, one of the days when I was prepping this video, it snowed, so I was able to shoot several photos to see if the newer iPhones are better at capturing fast-moving objects. Now I know snow doesn't seem like, a fast-moving object, but here is a shot from the 6 and a shot from the XR. Snowflakes are blurry in the 6, definitely not as blurry in the XR. I took 3 different sets of photos between all these devices, and the result was the same. Basically, I would say that anything after the 8s performed equally. Now when it comes to the selfie camera, did you know that the iPhone 6s only had a 1.2 megapixel front-facing camera? The iPhone 6s has a 5 megapixel front-facing camera, and everything else has a 7 megapixel camera. So if you thought I was a little muted when it came to the pixel difference on the rear camera, I can definitely tell you going from a 1.2 megapixel camera to a 7 megapixel camera on the front-facing cameras, said camera a lot in there, sorry, is going to be incredibly noticeable. Even in this simple selfie pic, you can definitely see the pixels in the sky, whereas the photo from the XS, well, it doesn't have that pixelation. The pixelation isn't as noticeable on the iPhone 6s, but it is there if you're looking for it. Now on the iPhone 6s and newer, the front-facing camera was improved by Retina Flash. It basically does that, makes a flash. Now I really do love how Apple added the word Retina to the front-facing flash, because the higher density pixels totally matters when it comes to flashing our faces with light with our screen. If this is the first time you're watching my videos, I do encourage you to click subscribe, produce content at least once a week, and it's usually pretty awesome in my opinion. If you know somebody who is planning on upgrading their iPhones and they're having a hard time trying to choose, share this video with them, because the camera, again, as I said at the beginning of the video, is such a powerful thing. So basing your upgrade on the camera is not necessarily a bad thing. It's actually a very good thing. The biggest upgrade in the history of selfie camera comes from the true depth camera found on the iPhone Xs and XSs. I've read articles that claim that the detail is much higher on the true depth camera, but I personally can't see a noticeable improvement between the photos. The biggest improvement from my perspective is the addition of portrait mode on true depth camera, and unlike the XSs, the XR's portrait camera isn't hamstrung at all. Apple's 2018 iPhones has all the same features on the front-facing camera. Now I know Apple could have thrown a couple of software restrictions
restrictions like they did with the rear-facing camera, but I have a feeling that they're trying to appeal to a certain selfie demographic by enabling all these features of the true depth camera while keeping it at an affordable $750 US. Does anybody else think calling the iPhone XR a budget iPhone stupid? Now when it comes to rear camera videography, every iPhone in this video does 1080p at 60 frames per second. For the 6S and 7s, I do believe they shot 4K at 30 frames per second, and for the 8s and newer, everything is at 4K at 60 frames per second. Now, will this matter for most people? From my perspective, no, because 4K at 60 frames per second is going to chew up a lot of storage space. I shoot in 4K for videos because it just gives me more flexibility in terms of editing. I'm only doing this for videos, not for generic videos of my kid doing awesome things. When it comes to slow-mo shots, the 8s and newer iPhones allow you to shoot at 1080p at 240 frames per second, whereas everything else is 720p at 240 frames per second. This upgrade is awesome for me because, well, all my iPhone dropping footage is now in 1080p instead of 720p. But with all this talk about Ks, Ps, and FPSs, I do believe that none of this really matters for the average user. Why? Because most of us don't care if the video's in 720p or 4K when we're watching a stupid video about nothing on Facebook or YouTube. As of right now, when it comes to video content, it's all 1080p, and I honestly can't see it moving to 4K too quickly. Why? Because the bandwidth isn't there, and 4K videos are just an absolute beast when it comes to storage. 4K is literally 4 times the size of 1080p, so the file sizes do reflect that increase in resolution. Now, what features will make the biggest difference when it comes to videos? Optical image stabilization, or OIS. It basically reduces some of the camera shake caused by your inability to hold your iPhone relatively steadily in one hand, or two hands, or 3 if you have it. This feature doesn't exist on the iPhone 6s, and honestly the quality of the iOS has gotten better with each iteration of the iPhone in my opinion. So if you shoot a lot of video, the newer iPhones will be a bit more forgiving when it comes to shaky hands. Now on the newest iPhones, you will notice that the camera frame has a bit of lag to it, which is kind of an indication that the OIS is there. It's much less noticeable on the older iPhones. Now in terms of videos using the front-facing camera, the biggest upgrade actually comes from the newest iPhones. There are 3 noticeable features that improve the videos on the front-facing cameras, with the first one being extended dynamic range. Now, I did mention a few minutes ago that, you're really not going to see the HDR video content that you're capturing on your device because you need an HDR compliant screen to show it to you, and maybe if you're viewing it on your iPhone, then yeah, maybe it does have that, but most of us are watching this video through YouTube, so there's no reason for me to show you the HDR content. Like, this video comparison that you're staring at is really useless, other than to illustrate the point that because Apple says it's new, doesn't mean it's going to have a big impact on, your everyday life. Now, next up in terms of features is the cinematic video stabilization, which is the software version of OIS, and like all things that software is trying to mimic in terms of hardware features, it's just not as good. Now, this feature is listed as new on the 2018 iPhones, but as you'll notice in these comparison videos, the video quality in terms of stability actually gets better with the newer iPhones. But if you're still on the 6 and you go and you jump all the way up to the 10s, you are definitely going to see a difference in terms of video stability. The last difference is the fact that you can capture front-facing video at 60 frames per second rather than 30 frames per second. Now this matters to me as a YouTuber because it gives me way more flexibility in terms of editing video captured on the front-facing camera. But the average person, it's not going to matter whether you send your mom's birthday video message in 30 frames per second or 60 frames per second. In fact, she's probably going to complain that's at 60 frames per second because you're wasting her data. Now, last thing I will talk about with the front-facing camera are the animojis, or whatever the Me version is. Now, I personally do not know how useful these features are since I rarely use them, but for people who like to be entertained by turning their faces into animated animals while they FaceTime, then yes, that feature will make a difference in your everyday life. So again, if you're using the iPhone 6, upgrading to any of the new iPhones is gonna blow your mind away. With the iPhone 6s, because it had Force Touch, you might not, or 3D Touch, or whatever it is, it's kind of messed up in my head now. You might not want to go to the XR, you want to go to the XS. If you're going from the iPhone 7, in terms of a camera upgrade, you're not going to notice a big difference, other than, a small thing with the flash, as well as some of the portrait mode features that you'll be missing out. Going from the 8, the biggest difference is really just the front-facing camera. I personally, if I had an 8 trying to think about an upgrade, I wouldn't upgrade it until next year at least. If you've got a 10, why are you even watching this video? So that's all I got. Questions, comments, leave them down there. Again, first time watching one of my videos, do subscribe, hit the notification bell so that you get told every single time I upload a video. That's kind of all I got. My wife just came home with my kids, so I'm going to go hang out with them. Monty, go!